In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, an overlooked technique was about to change the way pioneers battled winter's harsh grip. One mountaineer's ingenuity melted ice faster than a forge, sparking a revolution in survival. But this discovery came at a cost buried in the snow, forgotten by all but him. Before we dive into the incredible tale of this forgotten trick, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this spark your curiosity, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will leave you in awe. The wind howled through the dense Appalachian forest, a cold, unrelenting force that threatened to strip the land of life. In a modest cabin tucked away on the edge of a snow-covered ridge, Isaac Collier worked in near silence, his breath visible in the air as he labored. Outside, the mountains were quiet, but inside Isaac was preparing to break the silence of winter. With steady hands, he arranged the large chunks of ice gathered from the nearby creek, stacking them carefully in a circle within the stone oven he had built with his own hands. Isaac wasn't an inventor by title, but necessity breeds innovation. The harsh winters of the Appalachian Range had taught him more than just how to survive. They had forced him to invent ways to thrive. Other settlers had their forges, their tools of warmth and steel, but Isaac knew the real trick to survival wasn't about brute heat, it was about efficient heat. And today he was testing a secret he'd kept to himself for months. The stones surrounding the oven had been carefully selected and placed in a design he had perfected over time. The ice, left in its natural form, would take forever to melt if just left to the mercy of the fire. But Isaac had learned something simple. The key was to create a thermal bridge. As he pushed a long, heavy log into the furnace, he took note of the heat radiating from the stones and the way it seemed to accelerate the melting of the ice. What had once been a slow trickle of water now began to flow faster. The ice chunks began to fracture and dissolve, turning into water at a pace that no one in these mountains had seen before. Isaac smiled quietly to himself. It was working. But he knew that others wouldn't understand. They'd call it foolish or claim it was simply a coincidence. After all, why would anyone think that such a simple technique could defy the common understanding of heat? Yet there he was, watching as the ice gave way faster than it ever had in his past, faster than it would under the heat of any standard forge. But this innovation came with a hidden cost. Isaac's success had drawn unwanted attention from the mountain's closest neighbors. In the shadows of the wilderness, there were eyes watching, waiting for someone to expose their secrets. The same neighbors who had once shared a drink with Isaac and admired his practical know-how now found themselves wary of his uncanny ability to outwit nature. Isaac wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in ways they couldn't understand, and that made him dangerous. Isaac spent the next few weeks perfecting his method, growing more secretive with each passing day. Word had spread, as it always did in small, tight-knit communities, but this time it wasn't just the local settlers who had begun to notice. Other traders, travelers, and even the occasional woodsman had found their way to Isaac's cabin, drawn by rumors of the Mountaineer's odd approach to melting ice. The cabin, once a humble refuge for a single man, had become the center of quiet curiosity. It had always been Isaac's retreat, his sanctuary from the relentless winter winds. But now it felt more like a laboratory, filled with tools, odd stones, and piles of ice stacked around the hearth. There was no denying it now. Isaac had discovered something. Something not just practical, but revolutionary. It wasn't the first time a mountaineer had innovated to survive. The mountains had bred countless men and women who'd turned necessity into their art. But Isaac's discovery wasn't about weapons or shelter, it was about life itself. The ability to melt ice faster than a forge could change the way people lived in these rugged hills. Water meant survival, and if Isaac could provide it more efficiently than anyone before him, he would become more than just a trapper or a farmer. He would become indispensable. The first to try Isaac's method were a group of trappers who had been forced to make camp nearby. The snow had piled high, and their ice had turned to rock. Isaac, without a word, had offered his help, showing them the technique he'd honed. At first they had laughed, unable to see the logic behind a simple stone furnace. They had no idea that Isaac's method was as much about understanding the land as it was about understanding fire. He had learned over the years that heat in the mountains wasn't just about the fire you burned. It was about how you channeled it. When Isaac demonstrated, the trappers watched in awe. The fire wasn't roaring, the heat wasn't overwhelming, but the ice nestled in the stone oven was melting at an accelerated rate. The men, their skepticism dissolving in the warmth of the cabin, asked Isaac how it worked. But Isaac only smiled and gave them a simple answer. "Sometimes the mountain whispers," he said, his eyes reflecting the calm knowledge of a man who had learned to listen where others didn't. By the end of the week, those trappers were gone, spreading the word of Isaac's method far and wide. But the more attention Isaac received, the more wary he became. In the quiet solitude of the Appalachian Mountains, Isaac had always been a part of the land, integrated with its rhythms and secrets. But now, as more people came asking questions, he found himself facing the very thing he had always dreaded: being noticed. Too much attention, too much curiosity could turn a man into an outsider. It could turn him into a target. Isaac realized that the true challenge wasn't melting ice faster. It was controlling what others would do with that knowledge. Isaac spent the following days in his cabin, the wood crackling in the hearth as he carefully tended to the fire. Though the winter wind howled outside, his home had never felt warmer or more dangerous. The knowledge of his ice-melting method was beginning to spread, and with it, a shadow that had followed him through the mountains since he first arrived: curiosity. He had never been a man interested in fame or glory. The mountains, for him, had always been about quiet survival, about the satisfaction of knowing that the land could be conquered, but only if you knew its rules. But now, as the firelight flickered across the rough-hewn walls of his cabin, Isaac couldn't ignore the growing unease that weighed on him. People had come. Travelers, traders, even a few government agents had started to appear on the ridge, looking for him. Some had come with genuine curiosity, eager to understand his technique. Others, however, came with more calculated intentions. The fur trade was coming to an end, and winter was growing colder every year. Men like Isaac were invaluable. Trappers who knew how to endure, how to fight back against the land's worst conditions. But those who sought him out weren't interested in his company or his insights. They wanted to replicate his method, maybe even claim it as their own. Isaac knew that the trappers who had asked him to show them his method would not stop there. They had been the first to witness his success, and while they had appeared grateful, Isaac knew that the true value of his invention would be lost in their pursuit of profit. It was the nature of men like them. Useful information, when it could be turned into money, would be used by anyone, regardless of its origins. The risk was high, but Isaac wasn't interested in hiding his discovery for fear of others taking it. No, it wasn't the theft of the idea that troubled him. It was what would come after. The mountains were full of men who didn't care about ethics. They cared only about survival, and they would take whatever they needed from others, regardless of the cost. That was the lesson Isaac had learned, sitting alone with his thoughts by the fire. Survival was never just about the land. It was about understanding the men who lived on it. And that understanding could either protect you, or it could become your undoing. Isaac sighed and stood up from his chair, walking over to the window. The snowstorm that had started earlier that day showed no signs of letting up. It seemed as if the mountain itself was warning him, reminding him that the world outside was harsh, but the world inside could be far more unforgiving. As the storm raged, Isaac made a decision. He would not hide his method, but he would protect it. There was no going back now, not when the knowledge had spread beyond his control. But he would make sure that the men who wanted to exploit his discovery would understand that they couldn't just take it. They would have to fight for it. By mid-February, the mountains had become a harsh, unyielding world of ice and snow, a place where even the most seasoned trappers would think twice before venturing out. The temperatures had dropped to unbearable lows, and the creek that Isaac had used to collect his ice had frozen solid. Every day felt like a battle against the elements, with the wind howling like a living thing, whipping across the landscape with the fury of a wild animal. Isaac was no stranger to these conditions. He had grown up in the rough Appalachian foothills, learning early on how to withstand winters that could break a lesser man. But the cold was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing just beyond the mountains, the storm of men who had come to take what Isaac had created. Word of Isaac's technique had spread like wildfire. At first it was the usual curiosity of other trappers, but soon even outsiders had begun to arrive. Among them were traders looking to capitalize on Isaac's success. Some had money, some had influence, but all of them had something in common, an unspoken desperation that hinted at something darker. Isaac could feel the weight of their gaze whenever they spoke to him. A pressure that gnawed at the back of his mind. It wasn't long before Isaac realized that it wasn't just the trappers who were interested in his method. The traders, the men from the distant towns, had all come with their own agendas. They wanted to make a deal, of course, to share knowledge and perhaps trade. But Isaac knew what they were really after. They wanted to control it, his method, his discovery, his legacy. One evening, as Isaac sat by the fire, the door to his cabin opened with a sharp crack. A figure entered, draped in a heavy cloak of furs. The man stood tall, with an air of authority about him, his eyes scanning the room as though calculating its value. Isaac knew immediately who it was. The man was a trader, one of the many who had been circling him for weeks. "Evening," Isaac said, his voice low and steady. He didn't rise from his seat by the fire. The trader nodded, his face unreadable beneath his thick beard. "I hear you've got something worth seeing," the man said, his tone casual, though his eyes narrowed as if weighing the words before they left his lips. Isaac didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched the man carefully, reading the subtle tension in his stance. Isaac had dealt with men like him before, men who would smile while they schemed, who would offer their hands while plotting their next move. He knew this man's type well. "You've heard right," Isaac said finally, his voice steady but carrying a weight behind it. "But I don't give everything away for free." The trader's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not. You wouldn't be the first man to protect his secrets, but there's no harm in sharing knowledge for the right price." Isaac didn't flinch. "There's more harm in giving away everything," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the first one to ask, and I reckon you won't be the last." The trader studied Isaac for a moment before nodding slowly. "No, you're right about that. But in the end, we all have our price. I think we'll find yours, eventually." Isaac's hand instinctively reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. The words were harmless enough, but there was a dangerous undertone to them, one that told Isaac everything he needed to know. This man wasn't here just to learn, he was here to claim. Isaac stood, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. The trader's eyes shifted slightly, but Isaac's stance remained firm. "You'll find my price is higher than you think," Isaac said, his voice cold now. The trader chuckled, but Isaac could tell that the smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if echoing the brewing tension in the room. It wasn't just the snow that would bury Isaac's secret. It was the men who were coming for it. The days seemed to blur together as winter held its icy grip over the mountains. The relentless snowstorm that had begun in mid-February now stretched into March, leaving everything coated in a thick blanket of white. Isaac's cabin, once a refuge from the harsh landscape, now felt like a prison. The walls, though sturdy and well-built, couldn't block out the mounting pressure outside. Isaac knew that the men who had come for his secret would not be satisfied until they got it. He had tried to keep his head down, but the constant knocks at his door told him that his quiet life was over. The traders had continued their visits, some offering money, others offering promises of safety and a future of prosperity if Isaac would just share his method. But Isaac knew better. He had lived through enough seasons of hardship to recognize when men were driven by more than just curiosity. They wanted control over the knowledge that could change the course of survival in the mountains. But it was the letter that arrived on the 5th morning of March that truly shook Isaac to his core. It was delivered by a young boy, no older than 12, who had trudged through the deep snow just to bring it. Isaac opened the envelope carefully, his hands cold despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. The letter was brief, written in a hurried, scrawled hand. Isaac Collier, we've heard the rumors. Your trick with the ice has reached the ears of men who can pay a steep price for it. We'll be coming for you soon. Don't make us take it by force. Leave the mountains while you can, before things get worse. You've been warned. The Mountain Men. Isaac felt his blood run cold. The Mountain Men were not a group of trappers he had ever known, but he knew the name well enough. It was whispered in dark corners of taverns and passed around campfires as a name that commanded respect and fear. They were a shadowy group, known for taking what they wanted and leaving nothing behind. If they were coming for him, it wouldn't be for a peaceful discussion. He folded the letter slowly, his mind racing. The traders, the men who had been circling him, were nothing compared to this. He had underestimated the lengths that people would go to for a simple technique. What had started as a quiet invention for survival had now become a commodity in the eyes of ruthless men who would stop at nothing to control it. Isaac stood, walking to the window and peering out at the swirling snow. His cabin was isolated, far from the nearest settlement. He had a few options: leave the mountains and disappear, or stand his ground and face whatever storm was coming. But deep down, Isaac knew there was only one choice. The mountains had always been his home, and he had earned his place in them. The secret to surviving here was not just about melting ice. It was about holding on to your ground when everything around you was trying to push you out. And Isaac wasn't ready to leave, not yet. Isaac spent the next several days preparing. He gathered what supplies he could, taking stock of his provisions. He knew that leaving wasn't an option, not when the mountain men were already on their way. The storm outside had worsened, and the wind howled like a wild beast, tearing through the trees and rattling the windows of his cabin. If the men who came for him expected an easy conquest, they would be sorely mistaken. Isaac moved quietly through his cabin, checking the locks on the door and ensuring his rifle was ready. He wasn't naive enough to think he could outfight the mountain men. He knew they were likely armed, skilled in survival, and capable of outlasting even the toughest of trappers. But Isaac had something that they didn't, an intimate knowledge of the land, of the mountains themselves. He knew where to hide, where to run, and, if necessary, where to make his stand. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the sound of the wind and the occasional crackle of the fire. Isaac had built his life in this place, his walls, his hearth, and even the ice-melting furnace that had started this whole mess. His ingenuity, his survival instincts had brought him this far, and it would have to be enough now. But despite his preparations, the anxiety gnawed at him, leaving him restless. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. If the mountain men arrived as planned, they would eventually find him. His only hope was to buy enough time to escape, or better yet, to make them believe he was gone. The mountains had a way of swallowing people whole, of hiding them from even the most determined searchers. Isaac knew every rock, every ridge, every creek, and he would use that knowledge to his advantage. As the snowstorm raged on outside, Isaac donned his thick wool coat and set out into the night, his boots crunching in the deep snow. The mountain air was biting, and his breath formed clouds of mist in front of him. He moved with purpose, heading toward the ridge behind his cabin. It was the perfect vantage point, a place that offered an escape route if he needed it. But as he crested the ridge, Isaac paused. Below him in the distance, he saw the faintest flicker of light, a torch moving through the trees. He wasn't sure how many men there were, but it didn't matter. The mountain men had arrived, and they weren't here to ask questions. Isaac's heart raced as he watched the lights draw nearer, their flickering flames casting long shadows against the snow. The storm had made it nearly impossible for anyone to track him, but the mountain men had their ways. He couldn't outrun them forever, but he could buy himself a little more time. With a quick glance at the approaching torchlight, Isaac ducked down into the dense thicket of trees, his mind already working on his next move. He wasn't ready to face them head-on, not yet. But he would in time, when the storm was right. The wind howled through the trees, a constant reminder of the mountain's unforgiving nature. Isaac crouched low in the underbrush, the heavy wool of his coat sticking to the dampness of his skin as he pressed his back against the trunk of a pine tree. The storm had intensified, and the snowflakes were coming down so thick and fast that it was difficult to see even a few feet ahead. But the flickering torches below him told him everything he needed to know. There were at least 6 men, their movement methodical and deliberate as they worked their way up the ridge toward Isaac's cabin. Isaac's heart raced. He had always known that this day might come, the day when the mountains would no longer be a refuge, but a battleground. But now that it was here, now that the mountain men were closing in, the reality of it felt almost surreal. He had prepared, had planned for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare him for the weight of what was about to unfold. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, worn notebook he had carried with him for years. It was filled with notes on survival, trapping, and everything he had learned in the harsh mountains. He had written down the secret of his ice-melting furnace, his innovations, and his observations on the land. It had all been in the name of survival, of making it through another winter. But now it felt like a relic. The secret was no longer his alone. It had become a weapon, and he had to protect it at all costs. Isaac's hand hovered over the notebook, torn between the idea of keeping it safe or burning it to erase any trace of his discovery. But there was no time for indecision. The mountain men were drawing closer, their torches lighting up the darkness of the forest, like stars in a stormy sky. He shoved the notebook back into his coat, securing it tightly. Then, with one last glance at the ridge where the men were climbing, Isaac turned and moved further into the woods. He didn't have to outrun them. He just needed to stay one step ahead. He knew these mountains better than any of them. The trees, the ridgelines, the hidden paths, he could lose them in an instant if he played it right. Isaac moved quickly, his boots sinking into the deep snow, but he had grown accustomed to it. His legs burned with the effort, but he pushed forward knowing that there was no turning back now. The mountain men would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and Isaac would not let them take it without a fight. He reached a familiar hollow in the woods, a place where a small creek ran through the trees hidden from view. The sound of the water rushing over rocks drowned out the howling wind, and for a brief moment Isaac allowed himself to relax. The cold was biting, and his breath came in shallow gasps, but he had time to gather his thoughts. Isaac knew this spot like the back of his hand. It was one of his favorite places in the mountains, quiet, secluded, and perfect for hiding. He had used it many times before when he needed to escape the dangers of the wild. But now it wasn't just the wilderness he was hiding from. It was men who would destroy everything he had worked for. The snow crunched behind him, and Isaac's muscles tensed. He wasn't alone anymore. The mountain men had found his tracks. Isaac's breath caught in his throat as he heard the crunch of snow behind him, followed by the distinct sound of boots moving through the underbrush. He was no longer alone. The mountain men were on his trail, and they were getting closer. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly scanned the area, looking for a place to hide. The hollow he had taken refuge in was narrow, but he knew it well enough to understand that if he could stay still and quiet, he could lose them. The creek's gurgling sound would help mask any noise he made, and the dense trees would provide cover. But there was no guarantee that he would make it out of this alive. He crouched low, his hand instinctively going to the handle of his rifle. It was a reliable weapon, and Isaac had used it to hunt and defend himself many times before. But this wasn't hunting, this was survival. If the mountain men found him, there was no telling what they would do to get the secret of his ice-melting technique. Isaac's mind raced as he thought about his options. He could make a run for it, use his knowledge of the mountains to lose them in the thick woods, but the risk of being shot in the back was too high. He could fight, but he was outnumbered, and these men weren't unfamiliar with the brutality of the wilderness. His only choice was to stay hidden, to let them pass, and hope that his knowledge of the terrain could give him an advantage. The snow kept falling, muffling the sounds of their footsteps, but Isaac could hear them moving closer, voices, low and gruff, murmuring in the wind. Isaac's fingers tightened around his rifle. His mind was calm, but his body was coiled, ready to spring into action if the need arose. He wasn't going to let them take what he had built, not without a fight. The men grew closer, their voices growing louder as they approached the hollow. Isaac knew they would stop here soon, and he had to be ready. His pulse quickened as he held his breath, listening for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a man's voice broke through the silence. "Tracks," one of the men said, his tone low but urgent. "He's close. Keep moving." Isaac's eyes narrowed. He had to make his move now before they got any closer. He rose silently from his crouch and moved deeper into the woods, staying low to the ground. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused on the task at hand. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. Every tree, every rock, every hidden path. It was his home, and he would use it to survive. The men were getting closer, their search widening as they moved through the forest. Isaac had only one chance. He had to act quickly, or he would be trapped. With a swift motion, Isaac crouched low, moving silently through the trees. He could hear the men just behind him, and he knew that if he didn't make it out soon, he would be caught. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, determined to survive. As he neared the ridge, Isaac heard the telltale sound of the men closing in. They were getting closer, but Isaac was faster. He had one final move to make, the one that would seal his fate and hopefully allow him to escape the men who had come for him. With one last push, Isaac sprinted up the ridge, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in days he felt a spark of hope. The mountain had always been his ally. It would be again. Isaac's heart thudded in his chest as he pushed himself harder, climbing the snow-covered ridge with all the strength his legs could muster. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation sharp and cold, the icy air biting at his lungs. The mountain men were closer now, their voices echoing faintly in the distance. He had gained some ground, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they found his trail again. The ridge was steep, a jagged outcrop of rock and ice that rose sharply above the valley below. Isaac had climbed it countless times, using the terrain to his advantage, knowing every twist and turn. It was his one advantage over the men in pursuit. He knew this mountain like the back of his hand, but even as he ascended, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The snow fell harder now, thick and heavy, obscuring his vision and making every step a struggle. The mountain men had proven themselves relentless, and Isaac had no illusions about their determination. They wanted what he had, his secret, and they would not stop until they had it, or until he was dead. Isaac glanced over his shoulder, straining his eyes through the swirling snow. He could hear the crunch of boots in the distance, but there was no sign of the men yet. They had stopped for a moment, likely to regroup, but Isaac knew that they would be back on his trail soon enough. He had to get to the top of the ridge and find shelter before they could catch up. With a final burst of energy, Isaac reached the crest of the ridge, the snow underfoot becoming more solid as he crested the peak. He stopped for a moment, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. The wind whipped around him, biting into his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused solely on the task ahead. He knew that from the top of the ridge he could see for miles, and he would be able to spot any movement below. He crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, making himself as invisible as possible. His rifle was still slung over his shoulder, but he didn't intend to use it unless he had no other choice. Isaac wasn't a man to make unnecessary noise or engage in a fight he couldn't win. He needed to stay hidden, to let the mountain men pass, and then figure out his next move. Hours seemed to pass as Isaac sat in the cold, watching the valley below. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the men were nowhere to be seen. Isaac's eyes darted from one snow-covered peak to another, scanning for any movement. His muscles were sore from the climb, and his mind wandered to his cabin, his home. The secret he had created, the method of melting ice faster than a forge, was something born of necessity and ingenuity. But now it felt like a curse. Isaac had never wanted fame or recognition. He had only wanted to survive. But the price of survival, it seemed, was far steeper than he had ever imagined. Suddenly he saw a shadow move in the distance, a figure against the white expanse of snow. Isaac's pulse quickened. It was one of the mountain men, scanning the ridge below, searching for any sign of his trail. Isaac held his breath, watching intently as the figure slowly made its way along the ridge. This was his chance. Isaac turned and began to move quietly, sliding down the other side of the ridge toward a narrow gap between two boulders. The path below was treacherous, but it offered a way down to the valley, and from there a series of hidden trails that would lead him deeper into the wilderness. The mountain men had no idea where he was headed, and he intended to keep it that way. He moved swiftly, every muscle in his body urging him forward. There was no turning back now. Isaac had made his choice, and he would either escape or die trying. Isaac Collier's breath was shallow, his body aching from the long hours spent on the move, but he had no time to stop. He had finally escaped the mountain men, but he knew better than to believe the danger was over. They would come again, either to track him down or to find another way to steal his secret. As he made his way through the snow-covered forest, Isaac couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The storm had finally begun to ease, the snowflakes growing lighter and sparser, allowing him to see more clearly through the trees. He had managed to escape, but the question remained: what now? Where would he go, and how could he survive in a world where his secret had been exposed? Isaac had spent his entire life in the mountains, learning its rhythms, its dangers, and its quiet beauty. He had carved out a life for himself, a life that was simple and self-sustaining. The technique he had developed for melting ice was only a small part of it, but it had become something much larger, something that had drawn the attention of men who saw value only in power and control. He stopped for a moment, resting against the trunk of a tree, his eyes scanning the landscape. He knew that the mountain would always be a part of him, that it had shaped him into the man he was. But the mountain had also been a prison, one that had trapped him in a cycle of survival. Isaac had learned to live with the mountain, but it wasn't the mountain that had nearly killed him. It was the greed of men. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft light on the snow-covered ground, Isaac made his decision. He wouldn't run forever. The world beyond the mountain would be his new home, and he would use his knowledge of the land and his craft to carve out a new life. He would find a place where he could truly be free, not just from the mountain men, but from the dangers that came with the world he had once known. Isaac knew that he couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo what had been done, nor could he escape the legacy he had created. But he could shape his future, and for the first time in a long while, Isaac Collier felt the weight of his survival lift just enough to allow him to dream again. The mountains had tested him, but they had also given him something invaluable: his life, his knowledge, and his will to survive. As he walked deeper into the forest, the sound of the wind fading behind him, Isaac glanced up at the towering peaks. They would always stand tall, a silent testament to the trials of the land. And though his secret was no longer his alone, Isaac knew that it wasn't just the knowledge of how to melt ice that mattered. It was the strength to face whatever came next and to continue living no matter what the world threw at him. The legacy of the mountain would remain, etched in every step he took.